Hi, welcome to ThinkTech Asia, coming to you from downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. I'm Associate Professor of Geography at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my guest today is Professor Kate Lingley, Professor of Chinese Art History, also from University of Hawaii at Manoa. And our topic today is Buddhism and art in medieval China. Professor Kate Lingley is also the Associate Chair of the Art and Art History Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and her research focuses on Buddhist sculpture of the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, with a particular interest in the social history of the religious art. For those of you who are not familiar with Chinese history, that is over 1,400 years ago or before that. So in today's program, Professor Lingley will actually talk about the ancient stone sculptures in temples and monasteries and use them as a window to understand the early medieval patrons of Buddhist art in China, try to understand their identities, aspirations, popular religious practices, commemoration of the dead, and public identity. And Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So maybe we can start from the beginning, trying to understand Buddhism in China. For the audience out there, you know, China with the tradition of Confucianism and Taoism, and also Buddhism, which actually came to China about 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty, right?
Give or take, yeah. As we know, Buddhism is a religion that's born in India, and North India, and spreads really all over the world from India. China is kind of the first point of entry for East Asian Buddhism. So here in Hawaii, where quite a large number of people are Buddhists, and particularly Buddhists in either the Japanese or the Chinese traditions, this is kind of the first step in the growth of those religious traditions. So Buddhism actually first comes to China in the 1st century of the Common Era, about 2,000 years ago, give or take. We don't know the exact date that it comes. There's a few legends that suggest it's sort of at the end of the 1st or beginning of the 2nd century. But what seems to happen is that China in the Han Dynasty, as in later centuries, was very much connected to the Asian continent by overland trade. And a number of monks, merchants, various missionary types came from India and Central Asia along the Silk Road, and also along the sea route from South Asia. The sea route is, one is often more familiar with the Silk Road transmission of Buddhism than the sea route, but it does come both ways. And as far as we can tell, Buddhism in the Han Dynasty, so in the 1st century or two of its existence in China, is actually a religion of foreigners. So there's some evidence to suggest, for example, that although Indian and Central Asian, especially Kashmiri Buddhist monks, were permitted to set up monasteries in the imperial capitals of the Han Dynasty, Chang'an and Luoyang, that Chinese subjects, I guess citizens, not the right word, Chinese subjects were not permitted to become monks. So if you can imagine, it's almost as if Buddhism were being set up as a religion for resident foreigners. And of course, China was a very multi-ethnic place even then, so there probably were enough people to support that.
When you say the Chinese are not, subjects are not permitted to be the monks, how did it work? Who can?
The foreigners, so these Central Asian monks from, some of the earliest records we have are of monks who come from Gandhara, which is an ancient region now sort of straddling the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, Kashmir, a region of northern India, Mathura, which is also more central North India. These monks who came from afar, and possibly in part to serve foreign traders who were present in the Chinese capital, in the imperial capitals. But when we look at the evidence, so there are a few textual records that suggest that here and there a member of the aristocracy became interested in Buddhism, started to sponsor a few monks, but not a lot of activity going on the popular level. And the very few early Buddhist images that we have are placed in such a way that it makes it clear that the people who were making them didn't really understand Buddhism very well. In other words, so one example is a famous tomb in Sichuan, which it's a rock-cut tomb, so if you imagine a chamber sort of cut into the face of a cliff, and over the door, over the entryway, there's a little seated Buddha figure, very clearly a Buddha, halo, little robe, kind of sitting in the lotus position and so on, but placed in a tomb, which is very peculiar from the point of view of orthodox Buddhist belief, right? You don't, and it's a huge, elaborate tomb. So you wouldn't, Buddhism treats the body as something that you shouldn't get too attached to. So
the tomb idea is more Chinese.
Yeah, to have a big fancy tomb of that kind is sort of not very Buddhist. But Chinese popular religion at the time believed in, and actually I would say continues to believe in, a multiplicity of gods, right? So there's Hotu, the deity of the earth, who's kind of local. There's the city god. There's the ancestors. There's all Yao and Shun, these kind of ancient sage kings. There's all kinds of immortals and gods. And so it seems pretty clear that when the Chinese first encountered the Buddha, here's another god, and maybe he has some mojo, if you see what I mean. Maybe he has some strength to offer us. So we should make offerings to him, maybe we'll get some benefit out of it. So the earliest images do appear in sort of these odd places in tombs, especially in Sichuan.
So when you talk about images, are these the stone-made kind of structures that?
Well, the images that survive, even from the very earliest period, tend to be made in stone or bronze. And the stone ones survive better than the bronze ones because bronze, of course, retains its value as metal. And for most of China's history, coinage is made of bronze. So every once in a while, there's a sort of a grand movement to melt things back down and make currency out of them. So the bronze can be melted down, but stone really can't. But in fact, there were probably also images painted on silk, images sculpted in wood and dry lacquer. So there's probably a body of material that's been lost just because it was made in either ephemeral or not so permanent kinds of materials.
So your work is trying to use these sculptures as a way to kind of understand the patrons, art patrons at the time, which is a really fascinating angle to look at the sculptures. And you also talk about how the sculptures really reflected the more of a popular Buddhist beliefs. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's the difference between the popular approach and the orthodox approach?
Right. Okay. So after this initial period of Buddhism in China, the real first flourishing of Buddhism in China takes place in, as you say, the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, which is sort of roughly about the year, let's say about 400 to 600. That's a simplification. But anyway, there's clearly some sort of popular belief growing over time, and then what happens in the wake of the fall of the Han is that North China is conquered by a series of non-Chinese ruling houses. So the northern dynasties are ruled by people who are themselves not ethnically Chinese. And Buddhism becomes a way for them to bridge the gap between themselves and their Chinese subjects. So the imperial houses of the northern dynasties went for sponsoring Buddhist art in a very big way. Monasteries, cave temples, which are cut into sort of chambers cut into the rock and decorated with sculpture, all kinds of things, huge translation projects of the sutras. So now we're into a period when Buddhism is really operative as Buddhism and not just as some kind of strange foreign religion. And what happens is that so if you're interested in the history of Buddhist philosophy or the history of Buddhist ideas, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens with how do you translate a Buddhist sutra with these complicated kind of Sanskrit ideas, from Sanskrit into probably Prakrit, and then from Prakrit into Sogdian, and from Sogdian into Chinese. It's going through several languages along the way, and what kinds of terms do you use? They're often borrowed from Taoism. That's one part of it. But Buddhism, I think, would never have taken off in China if it weren't popular. And the popular perspective is clearly a little different. So if you think a good example is the concept of nirvana, which in theory is supposed to be the goal of the Buddhist believer, right? Well, nirvana is escape from the cycle of rebirth. It's really, the word really means extinction, right? So if you achieve nirvana, you're gone from the universe. That's pretty abstruse, and it's a little hard to understand why that should be a goal. There are some intermediate steps along the way. In particular, the Buddhist imagination in China is very captured by the idea of the Pure Lands, which are essentially Buddhist paradises. The most famous one is the Western Pure Land of Amitabha. And if you're good enough, right, if your karma is good enough, you will, when you die, you may be reborn in one of the Pure Lands of Buddhism. From an orthodox point of view, well, that's just another step toward nirvana, right? That's not your final goal. But when you look at the inscriptions on these statues, it becomes clear that, in fact, what people were hoping for was rebirth in the Pure Land. They very rarely mention nirvana.
So they don't go all the way to nirvana. They
right,
stop
right.
at Pure Land.
And the Pure Land, the stories that describe the Pure Lands talk about how beautiful they are and how everyone's happy, and you live in comfort and you always have enough to eat, and there's musical instruments flying around playing themselves. It's a little bit fantastical, but it's easy to understand as a kind of heaven, right? And that's, I think, much easier for your sort of average lay believer to grasp than some of the very abstruse and abstract notions of what we might consider an orthodox approach to Buddhism.
So this is probably a good place for us to take a break, and after the break we can look at some of the images that you brought to the show, and also get really into trying to understand the patrons who actually contribute to the making of those sculptures. Again, this is ThinkTech Asia, and I'm your host, Hong Jiang. We've been talking about Buddhism and art in medieval China. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Aloha, this is Keli'i Akina. It's my privilege to be the host of Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Ehana Kako, what does that mean? Well, many people have heard of Epule Kako, let's pray together. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Let's work together to build a better economy, government, and society. And every week, Monday from 2 to 3 o'clock, you will see movers and shakers and other people who are working together to build a better economy, government, and society. Again, I'm Keli'i Akina on the Ehana Kako weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Aloha. See you here Mondays 2 to 3.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. We've been speaking with Kate Lingley, Associate Professor of Chinese Art History, Buddhism and Art in Medieval China. So right before the break, we were just talking about laying some of the background of Buddhism in China and the importance of these artifacts and sculptures. The control room let us look into some of the images.
Okay, so the actual examples of art that I study include sites like this one. This is the terrace of the 3 Binyang caves at Longmen, a site south of the city of Luoyang. So what you're seeing is a cliff face that has been artificially flattened, and then into which these 3 large caves have been cut. And they have a lot of sculpture inside, which we'll look at in a second, but I want people to also notice how many smaller niches are surrounding them. The three big caves were sponsored by an imperial patron, and once the emperor sponsors a cave, then everybody else kind of wants in on the prestige. So a lot of the smaller niches that you see around were sponsored by aristocrats or groups of perhaps less wealthy people who also wanted to gain religious merit at the same site.
Let's look at the next one. And then this is the inside.
Right, so this is one of the three. The central cave has three sculptural groups, one on the back wall and one on each of the side walls. This is on the left side wall, and it shows a standing Buddha and two bodhisattvas. It's just an example of the kind of sculpture. This is carved out of the living stone, right, carved right out of the wall of the cave. And these are monumental sculptures. They're actually about 20 feet high. They're considerably larger than life size. So that's just to give people an idea of the kind of icons that would be present in these cave temples. People would treat them as temples, go in, make offerings, perhaps meditate. There were sutra lectures and things like that. They were temples in most real senses of the word.
And next one, please.
And the other form of monument that I typically work on is the stele, S-T-E-L-E. It's a word art historians use to talk about any sort of upright slab of stone. And this one, stele like this one would have been set up either in a monastery courtyard or in a public place. They were frequently set up in marketplaces, public marketplaces, or at crossroads where people could see them. And they're visually pretty complex, but you can see that in the center there is a Buddha figure with some flanking figures along with it. There's some little seated Buddhas above the main niche. But down in front, I don't know how visible they are, in a series of squares there's little figures on horseback and standing figures that represent the patrons of the stele. And in fact, the entire back of this particular one is also covered with figures of donors. And each of them has a little inscription telling who they are, what they contributed toward the building of the stele. Stele were typically collective donations, so a bunch of people would actually organize themselves into a kind of club or society and pool their resources to dedicate this monument, and also to do things like throw a vegetarian feast. There was a whole ceremony of dedication for the sculpture. So there's a bunch of stuff that kind of happens around the sculpture as well.
That's very interesting. So after we look through all the images, I want to come back to the point of having the donor information on these steles.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
Let's look at the next image, please.
This is just a smaller example of the same type of image. This is another Buddhist stele, and it's a little easier here to see the donors. You see the
At the bottom there?
Right, at the bottom. So you see the Buddha in the central niche. He's flanked by devotees and bodhisattvas. At the top, there's some narrative scenes from the life of the Buddha, but it's at the bottom where you see the donors, and they're almost certainly, as we look at it, male figures on the right and female figures on the left. It's actually, technically, it's the males are on the left and the females are on the right, because we count it from the point of view of the main Buddha. And then the central panel that you see is uninscribed, but that's where you would have found the inscription. This is probably an unfinished stele, but that's where you would have found the inscription dedicating the sculpture. It's also possible that the inscription was painted on and has worn off over the years. Many of these stone sculptures were painted very brightly.
Next one, please.
Another example of a stele, and this one has two Buddhas, and it's visually very complex. And what's interesting to me here is that the main donors appear at the bottom in the form of an ox cart, which is what proper, modest, aristocratic ladies would use to travel in when they were out and about, so nobody could look at them, and a man on a very fancy horse. So there's one of the things we see in these donor images is a lot of different kinds of signs of status.
Next one, please. So
this is a site. This is just to give you a broader sense of what a cave temple site might look like. This is a site called Maijishan in the town of Tianshui in southern Gansu province. so Maijishan means haystack mountain. You can kind of see why it's called that. And then the entire face of the mountain is covered with monumental Buddhist sculptures. I think you can see the large Tang standing Buddha there, and small cave temples. And the walkways that have been built onto the face of the mountain are modern to allow tourists to see the caves. But they give you a sense of how many little caves there are and where they're located.
Next one, please.
And this is again this is the entrance of a small-scale cave. That door that you see is probably 4 feet high. I certainly had to stoop to get into it. So by contrast to those big imperial cave sites, there's also some caves and stelae that are really quite modest, just showing that Buddhist image making was probably not available to the very poorest members of society, but otherwise covered a pretty wide range of economic resource levels.
Next image, please.
And this is just a close-up of some figures of donors from another cave temple. This one in southern Hebei province from the late 6th century. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of figures that you see, there are 2 monks on the right with their hands folded. Again, the figures are almost always in some kind of attitude of reverence or making offerings. And then there are 2 aristocratic women behind them carrying flowers. And in fact, this particular cave is one in which the leader of the group of donors, the donors is a mixed group of men, women, monks, and nuns, but the leader of the patrons is a woman. So perhaps we can get to the role of women here as well eventually.
Definitely. So that's actually our last image. What's interesting and fascinating is, again, as I said, you use these sculptures as a way to understand the patrons of the art and understand daily life at that time and practices. So first tell us about the woman,
Okay. Well, so one of the challenges to those of us who work on Chinese history, which I think is no surprise to you, is that although we have an incredible wealth of written history from China, just volumes and volumes of historical documents and inscriptions and so on, the majority of historical documents that have been passed down were written by the same kind of, about the same level of society, right? So they're written by a small group of literate men who served the imperial government as government officials. And so although they had a lot of interesting things to say and they recorded a lot of very important information, they had a very particular perspective, and whole sort of genres of people get left out of the historical account because of this. Women is a good example. Women typically get left out of the family genealogy, for example. It's family genealogies in traditional China are lists of fathers and sons, even though the women are the instrument of, a man cannot fulfill his filial responsibilities without a wife. And monks and nuns kind of get left out of the story. Typically, poor people get left out of the story, and to a certain extent, non-Chinese people living in China sometimes get obscured as well. So one of the reasons I think that I went into art history was that I think objects, because they survive much more unpredictably, allow us a way to kind of make an end run around the limitations of the historical sources, as awesome as the historical sources are. So women in traditional China, while women in the 5th and 6th centuries were considerably freer than at some other times in Chinese history, they were much less cloistered than, for example, women under the Han Dynasty, probably due to the influence of nomadic societies where women had a lot more autonomy. But at the same time, they had a limited number of avenues for public action. But one of the things about Buddhism is that it's although Buddhism still valorizes being male, right? Like if you're a woman, you're supposed to be reborn as a man before you can go on to become enlightened. It's a little unfortunate, but so it's not exactly feminist, But most of the forms of activity that a Buddhist believer could do, right? So sponsoring images, donating to a temple, sponsoring a monk, on and on and on. Most of those were equally open to men and women. And to the extent that these monuments are going up in public, you can kind of think of them as a way of for women to make their mark in public, basically. So some of the only first-person voices we have from the period are typically recorded in these inscriptions and these monuments.
In addition to the fact that there are women there who are portrayed as the donors or patrons of the arts, anything more you can tell about the women, what class they are from, any more record you could shed light on about the women who are patrons of the arts?
Sure. Well, this is the trickiest part because, as I've just accused Chinese history books of kind of having their own agenda, and honestly, the Buddhist inscriptions also have their own agenda. So they're interested in questions of merit making and not so much in other kinds of questions. But what you can often do is triangulate between different kinds of historical sources. So one thing that I was able to do in one particular case was there's a niche which was donated by an aristocratic wife, right, a wife of a major aristocrat in the Northern Wei in the last decade of the 5th century in memory of her deceased son, which is pretty typical. A lot of these our donations are made in memory of a person who's died. But then I went looking for more information about her, and while there's not that much about her directly, there's information about her husband and her father and her father's family, and sort of there's historical books, there's funerary inscriptions and epitaph inscriptions and so on. And what I was able to find out was that her husband was married to a princess of the imperial family pretty early in his life, and our patron, Lady Yuchi, was the daughter of a disgraced kind of mid-level official. She wasn't a particularly high-ranking person, so it's unlikely that she would have been the primary wife. In other words, she was a concubine, right? And the princess, the imperial princess, was the primary wife. The imperial princess had a son who was her husband's heir. So in the conventional sense, we might expect that this family would be the husband, the proper wife, the concubines, the proper wife's son, and all the other children, who probably called the proper wife mother.
Yeah.
But in fact, on this niche, all you see is the husband, the female patron, so the concubine, Lady Yuchi, and her son. So in the image, which is placed in a public place, she's basically able to revise her vision of her family to focus on her and her son, and kind of write the other women out of the story.
That's an interesting. That's really, really interesting because the Chinese society, as you said, is very strict in terms of the hierarchy, and this is one place that the women actually can express themselves in certain ways.
Right. Yeah.
So it's time for us to take another break, and after the break, we want to explore more with you about what these sculptures tell about the patrons and their life and their identity. Again, this is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we've been talking about Buddhism and art in medieval China. We'll be right back.
Aloha. My name is David Day. I host ThinkTech Asia, and we talk about international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and we broadcast live every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in, and we'll see you there.
Recorded. Oh, I guess we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. And I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we just finished our short break, and we're coming back. And I wanted to have you talk about the back of the stele that you said there's these more descriptions of the donors. Just in general, what more can you tell us about the donor and the information about them and their life? Give us a couple of stories.
Well, so there's often quite a surprising amount of information about the individuals who were the patrons. They organized themselves into these, I mentioned sort of a club or a society, right, that was dedicated to pooling their resources to do various kinds of Buddhist patronage. Interestingly, they seem to have functioned as kind of mutual aid societies too. So when we find some evidence, in later periods we actually find the contracts that by which you found this organization, and there's all this stuff about how if somebody is widowed, then everybody chips in and gives them, so there's a lot more going on than just image making. But those organizations had their own hierarchy. So there's basically like a president and a vice president and a treasurer and typically a monastic advisor, right? So a monk or a nun whose job is to kind of make sure that everything's above board in terms of correct doctrine, and various other kinds of special donors. And all of that hierarchy is recorded on the image itself. So on the stele that we looked at first, for example, the major donors are on the front, and that includes both the people who were the leaders of the organization, and also people who apparently gave extra money to sponsor specific images. So some of them have titles. So the leader of the Yi, and there's a title called Wei Na, which seems to have something to do with collecting money. But then there's also people who are called things like Da Xiangzhu, which means the patron of the main image, right? So that suggests that somebody paid extra in order to have their name attached to the main image. And this really brings us in mind of contemporary patronage practices in the arts. So if you go to the symphony and there's a wall of donors' names, and there's the gold donors and the silver donors and the copper donors or whatever, there's kind of a hierarchy there. And if you as a donor are choosing to give a lot of money to some cause like maybe there was, you might ask to have your name put on a building, or you might choose to give anonymously. There's sort of different choices that a donor can make in order to publicize or not publicize what they've done. In China, typically, in these Buddhist images, typically if the donor is a government official, their title will be recorded, right? So you have the hierarchy of the organization, you have the hierarchy of official titles, and you also have family hierarchy, because there's often a lot of overlap between these organizations and lineages. So not necessarily nuclear families, but it's common, for example, to find a stele of the kinds that we were looking at in which the majority of male donors all have the same surname.
So it's almost like a family clan.
Yeah. It's probably connected to what we would call like a clan village. So a village in which everybody has the same surname, and they at least believe themselves to be all the members of the same family. You don't always. It's not always possible to prove that, but obviously that's how they understood themselves. So family, as we said before the break, is also quite hierarchical in China. So you kind of have these intersecting hierarchies, and there's the small cave whose entrance we looked at is an interesting example, because it has the names of 244 patrons inside, most of them members of the Chen family. And some of them are on the front wall near the Buddha, and some of them are on the back wall in very kind of low status locations. And what became interesting when I looked at it was that there are some very fancy people, judging by their official titles, in some very obscure locations on the front wall. So this probably one of the highest ranking officials among the patrons of the cave is actually on the front wall in a very minor position. So what's going on with that, right?
I wonder whether there's, this is also my question, whether there's some kind of intersection between the traditional kind of Chinese society and their kind of hierarchical relationship there, and also in the Buddhist kind of sense, there are probably different kind of hierarchy, or is there a hierarchy?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a Buddhist hierarchy in the sense of somebody, I'm more Buddhist than you, right? I don't think there's sort of hierarchies of belief or practice.
Who's practiced longer,
Right.
Or maybe Buddhism is promoting more of equality that interrupted some of the traditional hierarchy in the Chinese sense.
I'm not sure that we can answer that particular question accurately, but what we can do, and what I was able to do with this example that I started to introduce, was figure out that of these three, there's three kinds of hierarchy, right? There's official rank, there's rank within the organization, and there's family rank.
Yeah.
And it turns out that what's governing the whole thing is family rank, because when we look at the official titles of the people who were patrons, we notice that a lot of them are what's called honorary titles. So it's called jiaguan, or I forget what the other term is, but they're not actually real titles. They're honorary titles that are given to people who live to be very old. So it's actually related to filial piety, that someone who's very old deserves the respect of society, and the government would actually give them a kind of empty title, which came with a little pension, right? And so what I was able to figure out was that the people who were on the front wall of the cave in the position of prestige, they weren't actual high-ranking officials, but they were people who had lived to be very old, which in the family obviously makes them extremely senior.
So it's almost like some of the honorary titles.
Yeah, that's exactly what they are, honorary titles. And you can see in the history books, like at a certain age, on a certain year, the emperor granted the official title of district magistrate, right, xianling, to everyone who was over 90 years of age.
Are all of these donors believers of the Buddha or Buddhist practitioners?
I don't think we have any way of knowing. I mean, I would say that by virtue of being patrons of a Buddhist monument, I think that makes them practitioners. And in other words, making Buddhist images is one of the ways that you could practice Buddhism. And there's very clear in certain sutras, it's very clear to say, whoever makes a Buddhist image will gain merit, and so on. So I think
talk about this whole concept of merit.
Merit, yes.
Because it looked like the reason for the donation is about gaining the merit, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is another place where popular Buddhism departed from what we might think of as a more orthodox understanding, because in orthodox Buddhist philosophy, there's this notion of karma, which is a concept about sort of action and its consequence, and it's a technical definition that's a little different from the popular way that we use karma in English today. But in fact, from what we can tell, the popular understanding of karma in medieval China was actually much more in line with the way we think of it, which is to say that good deeds get you good karma, bad deeds get you bad karma, and there's kind of a plus and minus effect, and you want to have more things on the plus side than the minus side. So and depending on how much good karma you have, you get a good rebirth, or you have a bad karma, you get reborn as an animal or something, right? So that's from the point of view of orthodoxy, kind of an oversimplification, but actually seems to be how popular belief went. And so making images was one of the things you could do to gain merit. And you could keep that merit, right? It could sort of add it to your personal bank book, right? I mean, it's almost an economic model, which is also kind of an oversimplification. But you could keep it for yourself, right? Or you could offer it to someone else.
As a gift?
As a donation.
Of some sort?
Donation,
okay.
You didn't even have to, you sort of ascribe it to them, right? So there's very clear language in some of these donor inscriptions by which, there's a date, and then it says, I so-and-so made this image in honor of my deceased aunt. And then it says, I would like to take this merit and by it permit my aunt to be reborn in the Western Pure Land, right? There's a very clear kind of sense of like, I am taking this merit and I'm giving it to my aunt.
Okay.
And because I'm giving it to her, she'll have a better rebirth. So it's almost an economic model. It's sort of funny. And obviously, to give merit to another person is also meritorious, so presumably it kind of builds up anyway. And so there's often language in these donations that either says, I'm doing this for the benefit of a specific person, typically a relative who's just died, or there's kind of more general stuff like, may the emperor flourish, may the nation be peaceful, may all living beings share in this blessing, right? So there's some kind of boilerplate or more generic wishes as well that
so not
go with
just
this.
not just for your relative, but also for all people under heaven, so to speak.
Right, and that's the kind of Buddhist universalism
That's right.
that maybe seems more characteristic of Buddhism in particular rather than of. Whereas in the whole idea that you would offer your merit to the benefit of a deceased relative is actually very much in line with traditional Chinese filial piety practices, whereby, right, somebody, if your grandfather dies, he doesn't stop being your grandfather just because he's dead. You still have to provide for him. You make offerings.
And
so
that's where the cultural mix really come in, because in Buddhism, this is Buddhism is looking at individuals, what you gain in your lifetime and where you're going, whether you are going to be reincarnated or not, depending on what you've done, right?
Yeah.
And it's the Chinese concept of this filial piety that's coming in, and this particular example shows already this cultural mixing.
Right, and to be fair to Buddhism, it's not entirely an individual practice. There are, but it's there are plenty of stories. The stories from Buddhism, from traditional Buddhism, in which people are looking out for their mothers, for example, are the ones that become very popular in traditional China when Buddhism really takes off. So
I see.
There's this character called Mu Lian, right, who is a monk himself, but discovers that his mother, who's died, has fallen into one of the Buddhist hells, and he actually goes down to hell to rescue her and bring her back out. So there's a lot those kinds of stories. I mean, you can see the appeal,
So
right?
the Chinese can definitely understand that, and it resonate with the Chinese.
I think so. Yeah, I think it fit very well into existing ways of thinking about family.
That's right. It's actually time to wrap up. But before we wrap up, I wanted to have you maybe just use 1 minute to talk about your current work, which is related to what we've been talking about in terms of in looking at the sculptures.
Sure. So my current project is a book about portraiture in the medieval period in China. And these, as we've seen, the donor images on Buddhist art do go a long way to conveying the identity of the people they represent. There's another body of material that does the same thing, which is portraits of the deceased painted on the walls of tombs. So between the two of them, neither of them are portraits in the sense of looking like the person that they represent, right? This kind of idea that a portrait resembles the person is not happening. But they both convey something about the identity of the deceased. And my question in looking at the two bodies of material is saying, what can we learn about how people thought about identity by looking at these two bodies of material? So where's if you're making an image of your deceased relative to paint on the wall of his tomb, or if you're putting an image of yourself in a public place, what are the signs that you use to convey what's important about your own identity? So that's the current project.
And again, if you're interested in more of Kate Lingley's work, you can definitely easily check her out at her department website. It's a Department for Art and Art History, right, at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And fascinating to me, I work on China, but you are really expanding the kind of documents to study the medieval China by looking at these sculptures and images that are not in these kind of orthodox, quote-unquote, literature area, which is fascinating.
Yeah, the funny thing is those inscriptions often were preserved by calligraphers who wanted to study the quality of the inscription as an example of calligraphy, but by doing so they preserved all these really important historical documents too, which we now can kind of consider as historical documents.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And again, that is Kate Lingley on Buddhism and art in medieval China. I want to thank you so much for joining in, and I'll see you next Tuesday at Asia in Review. Again, this is Hong Jiang, and see you next time.